In a recent video, a fitness influencer made the following claim: the most important thing that you can do in your life is to sweat and to get physically active. But is this really the most important thing? Welcome to the Aging Well podcast, where we explore the science, stories, and strategies that help us live longer, healthier, and more purposeful lives. I am your host, Dr. Jeff Armstrong, an exercise physiologist with a passion for making science simple and life better as we age, with my co-host, Corbin Bruton. In this episode, we tackle the question, as exercise scientists, of what is the most important thing for aging well. Our answer might surprise you. The Aging Well podcast encourages informed decision-making and always consult your physician and scientific literature when making decisions about your health.
Dr. Armstrong, I'm laughing because of that video that you sent me. In the video, the woman says the most important thing that you can do in your life is sweat and get physically active. And then the video goes on to say that nothing is going to be better for you than exercise. And then it proceeds to show some interesting examples of exercises. You know, I did like the fact that they used some resistance training in there and even farmer carries, which we've mentioned a lot on this podcast. But I wanted to hear your thoughts. As a doctor of exercise physiology, what do you think the most important thing that one can do for their body? Is it to sweat and be physically active? Is that the end-all be-all to aging well?
From a physical standpoint, it's one of the most important things that we could do. Obviously nutrition and sleep, we've talked about that, are hugely important when it comes to the physical well-being. But what really got me about that video was that she was talking in regards to longevity, and it's like, in order to live longer, the most important thing that you need to do is to exercise and be physically active. And it's like, well, wait a minute, that's not near the most important thing. And certainly it's not the only thing. And so that video struck me as like, she has no clue of our SPIES model.
So as far as importance goes, where would you place exercise on the staircase of importance for aging well, I guess we'll call it?
I don't like placing anything in an order. And that's why, we tend to, if we do lists on this video, it's usually kind of poo-pooing a list that was done on some other platform. Because there's not necessarily a top priority. When we talk about SPIES model, and our SPIES model has evolved from, what I originally and still call, but a well-centered fitness model. And, emphasizing the fitness really leaned into my exercise science background, my exercise physiology degree. And, we started off thinking that for longevity, for good health, being disease-free, that the most important things that we could be doing, and again, not in a specific order, but exercise and physical activity, of course, diet, eating a healthy diet, maintaining a healthy body composition, and not smoking. And, the maintaining healthy body composition, getting adequate exercise, and eating a healthy diet are almost kind of triangulated. They're all interrelated. And, so we were putting added importance on that. But as this podcast has evolved over, 4 now almost probably quarter seasons of the Aging Well podcast, we've kind of recognized that sleep is important in there. And more importantly, and probably most importantly, I think, is the social connection, the purposeful social connection. And so I don't know that I would put anything on a top priority, but when we look at kind of taking that well-centered model and evolving it into, thanks to Jay, the SPIES model, our spiritual, physical, intellectual, and emotional and social well-being, I don't put any of those as kind of a necessarily a top priority. I mean, I personally would probably lean into the spiritual being a little bit more of an important principle in there, because that idea of, something greater than self. And again, from a spiritual standpoint, her notion in the video that, sweating and being physically active is the most important thing. I mean, talk about the most important thing in life. That is probably the most self-centered approach to living well that anybody could mention, because, who are you exercising for? Most people, yes, you can exercise for other individuals and, to help support your relationships, to, be there for your kids, your grandkids, to be healthier for, your partner, your spouse. But when it really comes down to it, in most cases, we are exercising for ourselves, for how we want to look, for how we want to feel, and those types of things. So it's not a very spiritual approach. It is almost entirely physical. And in my exercise science classes, I lean into the importance of looking at health and well-being and exercise science from a standpoint of biomechanical psychosocial. And that psychosocial piece brings in a bit more the spiritual, the emotional, the intellectual, and certainly the social. And so I think it's missing some tremendous pieces when it comes to what is really important for longevity. And we talk in terms of the SPIE model as the physical and the spiritual being interconnected and really forming the base of kind of what we would label as more of a triangle of well-centeredness. But nothing is more or less important than the other. They're all interconnected and they all feed into one another. And so I think exercise is important, certainly. But if that's all we focus on, there's no focus on nutrition. There's no focus on sleep. There's obviously she's focusing on body composition just by the nature of the exercise and everything else. So that kind of is a separate thing. But there's no social connection in there. There's no emotional well-being, and there's certainly no spiritual component to the idea that the most important thing that you can do is sweat and exercise.
I understand that they all kind of intertwine. But if someone is about to take that first step into aging well, and that's why I was trying to hopefully use the analogy of a staircase. I guess a stairwell would be a better option for that. Yeah. So as far as the stairwell, you still have to take that first step. So what would be the base step? Even though they're all intertwined, it's all a stairwell. You still have to climb your way up to the top. But that very first step, it seems to me, in your opinion, would be the spiritual aspect of it would be the most the important. It's not necessarily important because it's all a part of the same stairwell, but it's that first step that you would be taking to age well. Does that sound?
And I think that's sometimes a bit of a challenge to using analogies in describing, anything really, because there's always a point where the analogies begin to break down a little bit. And I prefer looking at the SPIES model as an asymptote, where all of those 5 dimensions are working toward perfection, and they're all interrelated. And so a step in one direction is going to maybe impact a step in another of the directions, but our goal is to be moving increasingly toward that asymptote of perfection, of longevity, of wellness and well-centeredness. And so when you think of it as just a single step, it becomes, okay, you got to pick one of the dimensions. I would probably say, okay, if we're looking at it from a stair point analogy, the first step that we should be taking is the spiritual step in terms of realizing that there is something greater than self, and we're not alone. We're not the center of the universe. And so if you take that first step as that spiritual step, then the rest of it aligns with that basic principle that, there's something greater than self. So now when I take the first step in exercise, I'm not doing it for my self-glorification. I'm not doing it for any self-centered reasons. I'm doing it with a more capital P purpose in mind, that I'm doing it to be able to be more available for others, to be more productive in my life, to be able to contribute to society, and all those types of things. And yeah, you're allowed to be a little bit self-centered when it comes to exercise. It's kind of, it's rewarding to see the individual gains that we might make in exercise. When we get a little bit leaner, when we feel like we look a little bit better in the mirror, when we feel better, we can move better, and all of that is great. And that feeds into our emotional well-being. And when our emotional well-being is more positive, then we tend to be more positive with others. And so that feeds into our social dimension. And the social dimension feeds back into, the spiritual, the physical, the intellectual, emotional, and so on. And so it's this ongoing kind of thing. And so, looking at it as a stairway, the steps are going to be a bit varied. It's like, that first step might be into the spiritual, the second might be into intellectual, so that we learn how to do what we need to do physically. So they're all intertwined. And so the most important thing I think to understand is that there's no singular pathway to longevity. It's not the physical.
Right.
It's not strictly spiritual, because you have some people who, you can think of like a monk going into isolation and just meditating and reading scripture or praying or, doing whatever a monk might do, isn't necessarily falling within the SPIES model. It's not well-centered, because maybe they're not exercising, they're not looking at nutrition. I mean, you do see in many cases where monks are much more SPIES aligned, but it's possible for us to get out of sync with the other dimensions by only focusing in on the one. If you're enjoying the Aging Well podcast, be sure to like, subscribe, or follow on your favorite platform so you will never miss an episode. And if you find our conversations helpful, please share the podcast with a friend, because aging is something we're all doing, and we're better at doing it together. And support our guests in this podcast financially by visiting the affiliate links in the episode description below, and use the links or codes provided for discounts on products we have vetted and feel comfortable recommending to our valued viewers and listeners. Thank you, and now back to the podcast.
Seems to me that the next step for you, so spiritual would be that first step. The next step would be finding a purpose, because, and again, I know you're not saying that specifically because everything is intertwined, but finding that purpose could go into like, what is the purpose? Is the purpose to get better with my fitness goals? Is the purpose to get better with my social goals? Is the purpose better to lock my nutrition in? And so I think it's that spiritual, and then the purpose would be the next step. But with that also being said, recognizing that the steps are all they're all intertwined. Seems to me is what you're getting at.
You're using what I would say is the small p purpose. And the big P purpose is
okay.
The general reason why we exist, and understanding what that is. And we could go in a whole rabbit hole of what is purpose, and how do we find our purpose, and what how is it defined, and everything else. But I think it's just more important, because everybody's going to have a more unique, individualized purpose, that big P purpose. But understanding that all that we do is for a greater purpose is where then we find those smaller P purposes and, okay, this is why I do this. And this is why I do this and why I don't do these particular things, because they're not in line with my values and my purpose.
Pretty deep.
Like,
So I guess I kind of want to move down this road just ever so slightly bit on the exercise subject, and I just kind of wanted to ask you: have you come across any new research that has changed your perspective on a specific type of exercise that one should favor more? For example, you're really into Zercher squats, which, to be honest, I had never heard of that until you brought it to my attention. I'm pretty sure that you never even taught it in class when I was a student. Now I know that you're a huge Zercher squats spokesperson, and for good reason. The information on Zercher squats is completely mind blowing on how beneficial they are. So I'm just wondering, have you come across anything new where someone's like, yes, you guys should be prioritizing these in your exercise routine? Or is it just, hey, just stick to the main functional resistant training style
that's a sticky
exercises?
question, because all you have to do is open up YouTube or social media, and you're going to see all the influencers. Just like opening this episode with a video from a fitness influencer, and that particular influencer, I've watched a couple videos where they do kind of the same thing. It's like, this is what you must be doing, and you can go down that rabbit hole of, these are the latest exercises. This is the most important thing. And this is what you should be doing when you're at this age or not doing at this age. And, I think we did one episode talking about, how calf raises have been labeled as the most important exercise for longevity. And it's all a bunch of BS. The reality is there is no one best this or that when relating to exercise or really any areas of the SPIES model, because we tend to ignore the principle of individuality. And so what is most important is what is most important for you in the moment. And so, I can look at specific exercises and say, okay, I value this one a little bit more than others because I think they're more bang for the buck, which is why I've kind of leaned into the Zercher squat. And the Zercher squat is something that's relatively new to me. And why, when you were in my classes, 10, 11, 12 years ago, I wasn't really talking about it. But funny thing is, last week in like my first day of exercise testing and prescription, a bunch of the students almost simultaneously brought up the Zercher squat. And, it's funny because one of the athletes in there was a football player, and he was saying, Coach Metzger had us doing Zercher split squats the other day. And so, it's an exercise that's catching on. But would I say absolutely everybody should be doing that one, or, should be doing this exercise? I would argue that from a strength standpoint, if you could only do one exercise for longevity, I would do the Zercher squat, because it's going to benefit the calves. It's going to benefit the upper body. It's going to not necessarily benefit grip strength, which is probably the weak side of it, but it's a great exercise. But from a science standpoint, we go back and forth. I mean, you'll see, depending on which direction the wind is blowing, you'll see so-called experts that are telling you to do high volume, lighter weights, higher intensity, lower volume. There's so many different methods that I don't think any one is superior to another, because every aspect of our health fitness as well as our neuromotor fitness has applications to our well-being and our longevity. And so there are different ways to skin a cat. And so, not that I recommend going and skinning cats, but that's as the saying goes, there's just so many ways that we can approach all of these different dimensions of wellness that no one pathway is going to be the most effective for everybody. But there are pathways that might be a little bit more effective. But what we have to do as individuals is find what works the best for us individually, for our goals, and for our personal needs.
Yeah, that's good. Let's move on, but also step back a little bit. Earlier, you mentioned the importance of sleep hygiene. And now we've had some amazing conversations with some of our guests on this podcast, specifically those that focus in their field of study of the realm of sleep hygiene. And now we know it's important. We know that there's no number one importancy, but if, in your opinion, if you had to put the next step on that stairwell, in your opinion, where would
I would think sleep would fall pretty strongly on there. I mean, again, we've talked about exercise being kind of our primary pillar for so long, and then as we've added purposeful social connections and sleep into the 6 pillars, I think, kind of working backwards to those is that, the purpose and, the social connections have a very high priority and are probably more important to us overall than the other 5. But sleep is a really important central principle or pillar for longevity, because if we are not getting adequate sleep, we know it's going to have detrimental effects on our brain health, and that's going to impact longevity. It's going to impact us in our social connections, in our even intellectual capacity, all these different areas, and especially from the standpoint of exercise and maintaining healthy body composition. If we're not getting adequate sleep, we are not adequately recovered and restored to be able to go into the gym the next day, do whatever exercise we're going to be doing effectively, because we're too tired, we don't have the motivation, we don't have the physical energy, a little energy down to the point of the ATP in order to be able to do the exercise effectively. So the stimulus is going to be reduced when we're not getting enough sleep. And then once we stimulate whatever body system we're trying to adapt to, then we need recovery. And if we're not getting adequate recovery, then we're not getting the appropriate results out of that exercise or that physical activity. And so sleep is pretty important keystone in there. And maybe this is how we need to look at many of these, is that we have, you have keystone, maybe primary keystone in the arch of life. Another little analogy in there, but the keystone, anybody that understands kind of architectural structure, the keystone is what allows for a stone arch to hold together. And so if the keystone is the purpose, which, again, purpose can be multidimensional, but that key purpose and social connection, then additional kind of important stones in that arch are going to be sleep, and it's kind of almost a more secondary keystone. And then you get into, the role of physical activity, nutrition, and all those. Probably the least important on our list for longevity is probably the no smoking. And not that I'm saying, it's okay to smoke, but I'm saying that, smoking has hugely detrimental effects to our health. But there are a lot of other things that could kind of go into that same little bucket as well. So it's really almost
right.
Smoking is analogous to all unhealthy behaviors that can contribute to an early death. But, we talk a lot of we could put alcohol use in there. Well, alcohol kind of goes into eating a healthy diet as well. So the foods that we're putting into ourselves, You can, maybe have an argument about avoiding carcinogens in general being in that particular umbrella under don't smoke. And I had this conversation last night, at the dinner table with my son. He was, basically saying that all disease is preventable. And, he was kind of arguing back with me. It's like, no, and he's like, well, what about cancer? Well, you can prevent cancer if you avoiding any kind of initiator or potentiator of cancer, any kind of carcinogen or anything that's going to allow those carcinogens to mutate your cells and, develop into a metastasizing mass of deformed, dysfunctional cells, you can prevent disease. So I don't know if that answered your question well enough, but. If you're enjoying the Aging Well podcast, be sure to like, subscribe, or follow on your favorite platform so you will never miss an episode. And if you find our conversations helpful, please share the podcast with a friend, because aging is something we're all doing and we're better at doing it together. And support our guests in this podcast financially by visiting the affiliate links in the episode description below, and use the links or codes provided for discounts on products we have vetted and feel comfortable recommending to our valued viewers and listeners. Thank you, and now back to the podcast.
I mean, that's probably, I'd like to hear that conversation on how that overall went at your dinner table. Because I think it could easily be argued on both sides. But I think it's really cool that both sides, you and your son, can actually listen to each other and pick each other's brain and hear different perspective that may or come in full agreement. And that's what a good conversation is about. And I would have really liked to be a part of that one. It did answer my question, but it kind of brings up another question that I have. So most of us have heard the importance of sleep and having a bedtime, or maybe we've heard, hey, you spend a third of your life sleeping and it's important to get it's important to get your 8 hours in. And everything that you mentioned, hey, if you lack sleep, these are the side effects of your body, mentally, physically, emotionally. And yet people are not prioritizing sleep. And why do you think people don't prioritize it as much, knowing the importance of it? And what advice could you give someone to just eliminate that excuse and start prioritizing their sleep?
It's not that people don't prioritize sleep. I think that people allow circumstances to interfere with that prioritization, and we have a society that is structured around distracting us from sleep. If you think about it, I mean, I grew up, the evening news was at 11 o'clock, so if you wanted to, tune into what's going on in the world, you had to stay up until 11 o'clock. Well, how healthy is that for us to, especially in today's age, to get the news at 11 o'clock and then go to bed and, probably not sleep for a full 8 hours, but you're tossing and turning. Even if you are in bed for 8 hours, you're not getting as good a quality of sleep because your brain is just bouncing around considering all of the events of the day and what's going on tomorrow. And, we have, all aspects of news media and social media that just feed into our fears and our anxiety and everything else is not allowing us to sleep very effectively. And then we're so addicted to our screens that we're on our phones, we're on our laptops, we're on our iPads well into the night before, even as we're looking to go to bed. We're watching TV. How many people have TVs in their bedroom and watch TV up until, okay, I'm going to turn the lights out and go to bed now? You're not going to sleep well. And so I think people prioritize sleep, but they don't understand the real deep underlying importance of sleep and the content of that sleep. It's not just putting your head on a pillow for 8 hours. It's how much deep sleep are we getting? Are we getting adequate REM sleep? How often are we getting up during the night? Are we actually sleeping when we're in bed, or are we just kind of staring at the ceiling? And so it's not a matter so much of, I think people don't prioritize. I think that we just don't understand enough the importance of sleep and, prioritize the quality of sleep and everything else and the consistency of sleep. We don't understand enough the circadian rhythms and their role in maintaining our hormones and our recovery and just just the importance for our overall health and longevity. And so I think that's the big issue, is not that we don't want to sleep. It's just that we have so many things pulling us away from sleep that prevent us. I was just interviewing somebody yesterday who has young kids, and I was thinking about, and he was talking about, not getting as much sleep because you have young kids. And I have a student too who his son just turned a year this week, and he's talking about still not quite getting enough sleep. And I realized, well, you don't get that sleep for a while, and then you have a brief kind of period in time where the age of the kids, you get some sleep, and then they get into high school, and then you start having all these sporting events and practices and all these kind of things that Liam was wrestling on a regular basis. I was having to be up until almost 11 o'clock a lot of nights because going to matches, picking them up, transporting them around and everything. And I still had to get up the same time every morning. So that ate into my sleep. Now, he's in college, and, Ayla, where she's at, we don't have those activities as much. And so I'm able to get to bed at 9 o'clock every night and then still get up at 4 in the morning and hopefully get a workout in or do my journaling, do those types of things. And so oftentimes life is not the most convenient for our sleep patterns.
So if you had to change your field of study and be a doctor in sleep hygiene, would you prescribe some special equipment to have people sleep better? And I'm talking about Garland watches, CPAP machines, blackout curtains, weighted blankets. What would you recommend to your clients, I guess you could say, in order to
Well, I
have
don't
them
think I
have a
have to
better
really
night's sleep?
change my field of study to engage in sleep hygiene. I mean, I certainly, if I was going to go to go back in time and go to med school or become a PA, it wouldn't be in the sleep studies. I wouldn't want to be kind of working a sleep lab all the time. That would, I just no offense to doctors that emphasize that, but that just would be a little bit too boring to me. But as an exercise physiologist, I can still look at and I can still make recommendations relative to sleep. And I would look at
Mm.
the broad spectrum of the things that we can do to improve the quality of our sleep. The first thing is, we've just addressed the why question of sleep, why it's important to sleep. Now the next question is really the why not. And, what is your why now? Why are you not sleeping?
Ooh.
And one aspect could be that you have sleep apnea. And if it's sleep apnea, then what are the modalities that we have available to us that are going to allow you to sleep through the night with less disrupted sleep? And that could be a CPAP machine. It could be, some kind of mouth device. We had Nami Patel on last season as the green dentist and talking about how there's even laser surgeries that can reduce the size of your tongue so that you're not impeding that airway during sleep. So there's numerous things that we can do in terms of reversing sleep apnea and protecting ourselves from that. Some of that could be just even repositioning yourself in your sleep. So, what's disrupting your sleep? And for many of us, it might be sleep apnea. For some of us, it could be what we are eating, when we're eating. So trying to recommend to people to get to bed earlier, but also eat their final meal earlier. Try and eat more than 3 hours before sleep, because that's going to help disrupt, or it's going to disrupt your sleep. You can look at, you're getting caffeine late at night that could be impeding your sleep. Alcohol, we think that alcohol helps us to sleep, but the reality is we sleep, we might pass out from the alcohol, but we're not really sleeping. We're not getting good REM and deep sleep that's going to be really restorative sleep. And so looking at all the different things that could impact the quality of sleep, nutrients, having, I'm really leaning back into magnesium lately, after our last conversation with Patrick Sullivan. And I'm finding that my sleep is much more improved as I have more optimized my magnesium. And even going back to the RCP, that, looking at my iron and copper balance, I'm really leaning into pushing for my doctor to get my iron tested, because I think, I very likely have hemochromatosis. My dad had it, and, it runs in my family. Getting my iron in order is going to help restore my sleep, give me better restorative sleep. And since I've been doing more magnesium, I want to kind of boost up my retinol, start taking some cod liver oil, and trying to manage cortisol, trying to manage light balance, where I'm getting, what type of light at what time in the day. All of these things help me to sleep better. Having a bedtime, having a normal wake up time is important. But what else can we do to better improve that quality of sleep? Is it, turning off our devices, getting blackout shades, maybe reading a little bit before bed. So a lot of it is, what's preventing us from sleeping? What changes can we make in order to improve that sleep? And one of the best ways that we know that we're sleeping or not sleeping is by monitoring our sleep. And obviously, we're not going to be 24/7 under the surveillance of a sleep study, but there are devices that we can wear that are very effective. You mentioned the Garmin. Currently, I'm wearing the Helio strap from I think it's Amazfit is the company. Whoop is a great product. Oura rings. There's tons of different. Even the Apple Watch can monitor your sleep and give you heart rate variability, give you recovery. And in fact, I've been monitoring mine, and since I've been doing the magnesium, stepping up my magnesium both morning and night, I'm actually seeing my sleep scores have gone up. My biocharge, as the Helio strap calls it, my restorative sleep has improved by probably almost as much as 20 points. And so monitoring our sleep can help us to know, okay, the changes I'm making, are they effective or are they ineffective?
That's cool. Well, speaking of changes, you mentioned earlier nutrition. Let's talk diet. Diet would obviously be placed in that stairwell. What step it would be, I don't know. I think it kind of depends, right? Because it's all as we're talking, and everything kind of intertwines as what could be considered the most important. But is Mediterranean diet and the Nordic diet the most superior? And if
Well,
so,
I don't think
can you
any
explain?
one diet is going to be more superior. And in fact, we have planned an upcoming episode where we're going to come do a part 2 to our decoding the RCP and talk a little bit more about how the Nordic diet, the Mediterranean diet kind of feed into that particular approach. In Morley Robbins' book, Cure Your Fatigue, he emphasizes an ancestral diet, which is a very overarching umbrella term for just kind of eating whole foods, eating natural foods, eating less processed foods, and eating a diet that, can fall under, the Mediterranean type of diet, the Nordic diet. even, under a ketogenic type of diet, although those would be a little bit harder, I think, to get much of the nutrients that we need for optimal health. But, the diet itself doesn't particularly matter. It's the components of that diet that are going to make us healthier. And so, you can look at your diet as, your ethnicity and how that contributes to the types of foods you eat. When we look at the Mediterranean diet, it's not necessarily eating foods from the Mediterranean. It's eating foods that are, higher in legumes and vegetables and, reducing the amount of meat that we're eating. But when we're eating meat, it's going to be a bit more purposeful in why we're eating the meat and what we're getting from the meat. And so when we look at diet, I think oftentimes as we approach diet from a wellness standpoint, we can use that as kind of, again, that step stairwell analogy, as you called it, and looking at, okay, well, what's the most important thing that I can do first? And when I teach kind of weight management in my classes, I like to use a kind of a graphic that Dr. Mike Israetel presented in his book, The Renaissance Periodization Diet, or the Renaissance Diet. And it looks at, for weight management, about 50% of our success is going to come simply from caloric restriction, for a caloric balance. And so our calories in versus our calories out. And so if I'm looking at improving my diet, improving my body composition, having the right energy for exercise and physical activity, then the first step is just to limit my calories. And we know for longevity that a caloric restrictive diet has positive effects in animal models. Now, obviously, it's a little bit different in humans, but if we minimize our calories to what we most need in order to maintain a healthy body composition, then that is going to be one big step toward longevity and toward health. And then the next step is looking at our macros. So that's about 30%, according to Dr. Israetel. And again, these are just rough numbers, but they're not absolutes, and they're not necessarily documented in the literature, but logical sense. But the next big step is going to be to get your adequate protein, how much protein is essential, getting adequate carbohydrates, and then looking at how much fat we're getting in our diet. And we're still not looking at, the quality necessarily of the protein, the type of protein. We're not looking at the type of fat that we might be eating. And that comes kind of with the next step, where about 10% of our success is going to come from the quality of the foods that we're eating. Are we eating organic? Are we eating all natural? Or what kind of fats are we eating? Are we eating, more industrial oils? Or are we eating more natural oils like olive oil and such? And then we start looking at meal timing, the timing of our meals. And actually, timing of meals is probably more important than the quality of the foods that we're eating. And, are we getting our carbohydrates in and around the times that we're exercising, as opposed to having high carbohydrate consumption when we're most sedentary, where those carbohydrates are going to get into our fat storage as well as rather than our muscle storage. And then the final thing, that last 5% of the success really comes from, supplementation. And unfortunately, most people in our society are stepping into supplementation first, as opposed to changing all the behaviors. And so we see this push for GLP-1 and, these different drugs that we can take that are going to help us to lose weight. And yes, those are going to have benefits, especially in the most diseased individuals. But our top priority has to be taking that first step in just eating less. And then the next step, eating, better balance of foods. And then the next step, kind of getting into, okay, when and how am I eating? This is where, circadian intermittent fasting could come into play. and then start looking at, okay, now I'm going to start refining the foods that I'm eating. I'm going to start eating better quality, the best quality food that I can afford. And then maybe if I need a little bit more help, then I'm going to start looking at supplements. Does that answer your question? We'll take a quick pause to acknowledge the affiliate brands that help make this podcast possible. These aren't sponsors, and no one pays for placement. But when you use our affiliate links, it supports the mission of the Aging Well podcast. One partner I've chosen after careful vetting is Berkeley Life, known for their nitric oxide support products. I value their commitment to quality, testing, and education around vascular wellness, and I use their products myself. If you'd like to support the show and explore Berkeley Life for your own health journey, you'll find a link in the episode description.
Perfect segue into my next question, which is, so supplements, gimmick or important necessity for aging well? And where would supplements fall on the stairwell if they're needed? And if they're not needed, would we just toss them out? And if they are needed, which supplements specifically would you say, nope, these are staying on that stairwell? Like everyone should, if they're going to use supplements, these are the supplements that should be
I think,
included.
The use of supplements and where they fall in the stairwell is where I don't like the stairwell analogy, is because that puts us at an end point. And that's where I like the asthmatope analogy a little bit more effectively, because, as you start looking at supplements, the supplements are going to come into play when we're getting closer and closer to that asthmatope. If you think of longevity as the concentric circles on a target, like an archery target, and the bullseye being that target in the middle, that's our asthmatope. And in our first steps, we're going to have a big bullseye in the middle because it's going to be harder for us to hit anyhow. And so just to be able to come close to that bullseye, we want it to be bigger so that we're having success, we're moving in the right direction. And as we become increasingly successful and more well-centered, hitting that asthmatope of the SPIES model more effectively, then we start shrinking that target and it gets smaller and smaller. So our initial steps might be just, again, whether it's just starting exercise or just starting healthy eating, or, just starting down a spiritual journey where the first step is going to be just to start journaling and doing a little bit of gratitude with 2 T's check every morning. Those are the broader things. And as we get closer and closer to the center, now as we start looking at diet, sleep, and those types of things, now as we really refine things and zeroed in on, our why nots and are trying to find better ways why or how we can sleep better or how we can lose more body fat, and then the supplements begin to kind of come in. Now, oftentimes, and again, we're going to address kind of the root cause protocol. And one thing I like about that protocol is that we can broaden that out into other things beyond just copper, lead, and magnesium, or copper, iron, and magnesium balance. But, we can look at the same thing is we look at the root cause of our issues. The main thing is to start to eliminate the things that are causing the problem first, and then start looking at the things that we are doing to improve the situation. And then as we get increasingly closer to really resolving that issue, then supplements are going to kind of come into play. So supplements are always something that should supplement. And so they shouldn't be the primary thing that we're doing. And when it comes to longevity and we start telling people, you got to take these supplements in order to live longer, well, we're skipping a crap load of steps that aren't important. And for most people, they probably do not need most of those supplements. And maybe, a bit of a shameless plug for our affiliates. The affiliates that we have for this podcast, the ones that we have vetted and feel like these are the ones that we recommend most highly, are ones who recognize that nutrition, lifestyle comes first, and the supplements that they're selling are to help refine the process. And I still love going back to Dr. Nayan Patel's seesaw analogy when he talks about glutathione, that, we start throwing things like supplements at our health, we tend to disrupt that balance, and then something else is often going to have to come in to bring that back into balance. And so supplements come in, and once we've kind of figured out that balance, how then do we progress from there? And, when it comes down to supplements, I have to look at it from a performance versus a longevity standpoint. When I teach exercise science and I talk about supplements for performance, and these are things that are going to aid, they're more like performance aids. They're more like performance enhancing aids as opposed to really truly supplements. I think creatine falls into that realm because it benefits us in so many different ways, and most of us are probably deficient in creatine anyhow. Then we look at, whey protein versus casein protein, and again, it's really just a reasonable protein supplementation to give us adequate protein. But if we're eating enough protein, healthy protein, we don't need to supplement our protein. We don't need more than we need. And then you get into carbohydrates, so during training, having carbohydrates as a supplement to the training is going to benefit us. But, we don't look at, I need more carbohydrates because I'm training. We need what we need in order to perform. And then caffeine kind of falls in there as well, as that becomes a performance enhancer. And, again, we don't need to supplement our diet with caffeine. We just need to time the caffeine to where it's going to benefit us in our training. And if I'm getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning to work out, a quick dose of caffeine can help me have more energy and more focus to be able to train more effectively. None of those things are absolutely necessary in order to train or to live long. And then so we start looking at, okay, well, what supplements do we need? We've been fed, I'm increasingly coming to see a load of BS when it comes to multivitamins and a lot of the different supplements that are in our, the things that enrich our food. And the more I kind of look at the root cause protocol and the physiology behind it, the more I tend to kind of align myself with a comment that Dr. Patel made in my last interview with him, where he talked about the only supplement he takes other than his gluteral, the gluteral spray on a daily, sometimes multiple daily times a day regimen, is magnesium. And that makes a lot of sense to me, because as we see that magnesium is depleted very rapidly, as Morley Robbins calls it, we have a magnesium burn rate, and stress increases that rate, then we have a greater need for magnesium. And that magnesium is going to help us to improve our copper balance, our bioavailability of copper, so that we can better deal with the iron, the excessive iron that we're building up in our tissues. So I think, magnesium has got to kind of be up in there. And I would also look at vitamin A supplementation, not our standard vitamin A, but the more retinol vitamin A. So for like cod liver oil and those types of sources, those right now are probably the two vitamin supplements that I would most strongly recommend, because we are very likely to be deficient in those. And the idea of the deficiency in iron and vitamin D, synthetic vitamin D and other synthetic vitamins, we want to be a little bit more cautious about those. We want to get our nutrients from whole foods, and we don't want to have to be supplementing. And if we're having to supplement, then we have to take a step back and look at our diet and what is wrong with my diet that I need these additional vitamins, minerals, or, food-like products in order to function properly. Does that answer your question about supplements? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Now this next question might be might be kind of tricky just because it's really hard, even no, it's not necessarily hard, I should say. The research is ever changing and constantly evolving rapidly in this kind of field of study. But would you want to place like brain health or neurohealth in a category of the stairwell? And if so, has there been anything that just really pops out to you as interesting on how to properly maintain brain health and improve
I
just
think we might have to
improve it
reserve
in
this
general?
for another episode because we could do a full episode on neural health.
Okay.
I do think it's important, but again, it's not separate from the other areas because, again, if we take the SPIES model, the spiritual, the physical are all really, I mean, you can go down a whole deep rabbit hole in terms of consciousness and how that plays into spirituality and physical existence and everything else. But then you have the intellectual or emotional. All of those things are tied with our neurological physiology. And we've had guests on that have talked about hearing loss and the impact that it has on our social connectedness, on our functioning and our increased risk of neurocognitive disease and so on. And so, yeah, absolutely, our neurological health and physiology are hugely important to our longevity and how we take care of our health. I mentioned creatine and the benefits of creatine on the brain. It's hugely, hugely important. And so, we can't neglect the brain health. And so, yeah, let's maybe reserve that one for a future episode. But it is central, but it's intertwined with all of those dimensions of our well-centered fitness.
It's going to be an interesting episode because there's so much. The mind is, it's just, there's so much that goes into it. That might be a really fun episode to
and you could get into so many different areas too. I mean, like we've had episodes on the role of psilocybins in neuroplasticity and kind of rewiring the brain and other aspects of vestibular training and what it does for the brain. And there's just so many things that we could cover when we look at kind of neurophysiology and neuroaging.
Well, is there any other subjects that we may have missed that you want to add?
Well, there's a lot of subjects when it comes to aging well. And do I want to add? I mean, God, if we start adding too much, we're already, this episode, I believe, is going to be our 300 and, is it 60th? Somewhere in there. I mean, we're pretty far along. I think it's like the 300 and maybe not quite the 360th. No, I'm saying 380th. It's about the 378th episode, I believe. So we've covered a lot of topics, but it's just started to scratch the surface and open things up. So I think almost everything that we talked about today are topics that we can go into quite a bit deeper. And I think as we progress through season 5 and beyond, this SPIES model is going, and the idea of transformative aging are going to be the deep subjects. How do we go beyond just this idea of biohacks and supplements and exercise as the essential components of aging well, and look at how does our spiritual, physical, intellectual, emotional, and social well-being play into us aging well. And so, I think, kind of to just wrap this up is, there's so much that we can cover, and we've only scratched the surface. And so my gratitude with 2 T's to the viewers and listeners that have been with us this whole, first 4 seasons, now into the 5th season, and those who continue to be with us and join with us, the guests that we've had. But, if you are feeling value in learning about how to age well, then, share this episode, share the podcast, obviously like and subscribe or follow, and just keep keep with us as we strive to age well. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Aging Well podcast. Please like, subscribe, or follow, and share this episode with a friend. And be sure to visit the affiliate links in the description below. Thank you for listening, and until next time, keep aging well.